the Chinese New Year Parade. These days, the parade represents one of the few times the streets of Chinatown are as vibrant as they were in the past. Today's Chinatown lacks the spirit and sense of community of years past. Many of its beautiful, historic buildings are becoming more and more dilapidated as a result of lack of upkeep and decades of use. Many Chinese have continued to physically and emotionally detach themselves from their ancestral beginnings in this iconic Vancouver neighborhood. The Meiwa Hotel building at 258 East Pender Street was around when the exact opposite was true. Vancouver's Chinatown shares its beginnings with the founding of the city itself. A small lumber mill town until the completion of the Transcontinental Railway, which utilized the labor of some 17,000 Chinese, Vancouver grew rapidly in the late 19th century. With the railroad complete and Chinese immigration continuing, despite the passing of the racially motivated head tax in 1885, the demand for rooming houses soared. Many of the young men who made up the Chinese labor force continued to work in industries such as fishing and logging, in addition to clearing the land. The Meiwa Hotel, built in 1913 and originally called the Loyal Hotel, was the largest rooming house in Chinatown. Rooming houses such as these, which were located in the heart of the Chinese community, provided affordable accommodation to workers in a place where they could shop, socialize, send money back to China, and rest. Significantly, spaces like these also both provided and created a sense of security and social support. They were a home away from home for the countless Chinese workers who, over the past 100 years, helped to build British Columbia into what we see today. While the living spaces were cramped and sometimes below city standards, this proximity undoubtedly played a role in community building. The sounds and smells of dinner cooking in one of the communal kitchens, perhaps a lineup for the washroom. Much is owed to the Chinese pioneers who overcame prejudice, poverty, and squalor to carve out their own small niche. Just down the street from the Loyal Hotel was the Yue Shan Company building, which had been built by one such pioneer, a man named Yip Sang. One of the oldest buildings in Vancouver and the oldest in Chinatown today, the Yue Shan Company building was built over 100 years ago in 1889. The building went through several upgrades and additions over the next 23 years, reflecting the expansion of commerce and wealth for elite Chinese merchants. Yip Sang had 4 wives and 23 children, his family growing as rapidly as his business at the turn of the century. He was an example of the first generation of Chinatown merchant elites. Without significant wealth or education, men like Yip Sang nevertheless amassed considerable fortunes. In addition to constructing buildings and employing Chinese workers, these men became leaders in the community, helping to establish social service organizations such as the Chinese Benevolent Association. Throughout the beginning of the 20th century, the Chinese community in Vancouver continued to grow, despite a now extraordinarily costly head tax of $500. Between 1911 and 1923, Vancouver's Chinese population grew to 6,500. Chinatown was now firmly established, many of its buildings and stores now being made of brick. One such store may have been the one owned by Louie, best known for being the patriarch of one of Chinatown's most prominent families. The small grocery store he opened in 1903 would ultimately symbolize Chinatown's broad influence throughout BC. Louie furthered connections between Chinatown, Vancouver, and all of British Columbia because Louie owned many of the trucks used to transport the produce. Lines can be traced from small towns all over the province to Chinatown, reinforcing the notion that Chinatown is connected to all of British Columbia. As Chinatown prospered, BC prospered. However, in 1923, due to mounting racism against the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in order to stop all Chinese immigration. Until the act was repealed, 24 years later in 1947, officially, only 44 Chinese came to Canada. During those years, Canada Day was known to the Chinese as Humiliation Day, Nevertheless, the Chinese community bonded through activities like sports. The Chinese student soccer team won the Iroquois Cup in 1926, the Wednesday League Cup in 1931, the Spalding Cup in 1937, and the BC Mainland Cup in 1934. This was a source of great pride for the community. After the BC Mainland Cup Championship, celebrations broke out throughout Chinatown. A parade, complete with a hired band, marched through the small but jubilant Vancouver neighborhood. Much more than just a trophy, the success of the Chinese students' soccer team showed that unlike the racist situations of daily life, in athletics, everyday Chinese could fight and win.
Look at the faces on the sports teams, and you see the sense of pride, you see the sense of community.
It's strange. I mean, in spite of all the discrimination and the problem, you look back in the old pictures. There's such a sense of optimism, and hope in those days, and the future seemed to look so bright.
Fittingly, the day after the monumental victory was declared a holiday in Chinatown. This sense of togetherness was also reflected in the many associations and societies scattered throughout Chinatown, many of which owned their own buildings.